So far we have used, our positive attitude, and we've used our brains a bit to develop a question. But we haven't really used our computer and our tape measure and our thinking cap a ton yet. So what are the next steps in applying evidence-based practice to our professional practice? The next step is to acquire information and then appraise that information. I'm going to go over them separately, but I kind of put them together because as you're acquiring information, you should be thinking about the quality of that information, how much faith you can put in the findings or the conclusions that those sources make. So you sort of do these, I think, hand in hand. But acquire and appraise is where you search for evidence related to your question and you determine whether that information is high quality, relevant to your topic, and valuable. So acquiring evidence starts with a broad search. As we said, you start by just doing this background question and then you get to your PICO question. So you start with a broad search. I find the internet to be a great place to start in terms of just looking at different blogs, experts that I know, professional societies that maybe have position papers on different topics and so on. It gives me an idea of what's out there and identify appropriate search terms, especially in our example of the soccer athletes, right? I need to know what are my choices for an endurance training program. Maybe I've missed something. Maybe I'm not familiar with whatever the latest technique is. So you want to start by kind of with this big, broad search and then focus. Now, when you do start focusing on your specific question, then I would use search terms in your, whether you use Google Scholar or your library that you have access to. But Google Scholar, once you've graduated from the university, is still a great source for doing searches and finding peer-reviewed sources. And often they have links to full text to a lot of these articles. So, but to do those searches, whether they be in Google Scholar or through a library search engine of the literature that's out there, you need search terms, right? Well, PICO is great because that has already helped me identify the terms that I'm going to search. So if my question was in athletes, how does foam rolling compare to static stretching in influencing recovery after exercise? Those are my terms: athletes, foam rolling, static stretching, recovery. Those are the terms that I'm going to put in here, right? So I would use athletes. I probably would combine static stretching and foam rolling with the term "and," so I only get articles that maybe have both. And then I probably would include exercise recovery or recovery because, I prefer to have exercise recovery, but they may not call it that. So anyway, but I would start with those terms, search, see what I get. If I get too many articles, I can further narrow things. I can make things more specific and so on. But I really think, writing the PICO question gives us a great starting point for searching for peer-reviewed, reliable research to answer our questions. So as you do your literature search, right, you start to find articles, a variety of articles. None of them are going to be perfect. They're not going to specifically answer your question, but they're going to be close, right? Some are going to be on athletes maybe of a different age, but comparing the two things. You're going to get articles that are relatively close. You're going to also get articles of varying types. And I want to talk about appraising your evidence because, that tells us how much faith can we have in the results, right? If you've ever researched a topic, you often find that the results are conflicting. One study says this works, one study says it doesn't. When it comes to then using that information, we have to go with the preponderance of evidence in making recommendations for our clients. So we have to look at all of the evidence that's out there, appraise its quality, and then decide which ones we're going to put more faith into over others. That's where this hierarchy of evidence is useful. It kind of tells you how, at the start, how confident can you be in these different types of studies or different types of sources that you find. And we can see the things at the bottom are the lowest quality, and I'm not saying that they're not good quality, but they are the least supported of all of the different groups. So expert opinion, that's a person's opinion. That could be biased. It could be influenced by a company that supports this person or what have you. So expert opinion, while it's useful, we have to take it with a grain of salt and be skeptical. That goes with all the background information you kind of find. Then we start to see different types of studies, and I'm going to give you examples of each one and the increasing amount of support and quality that they are in terms of you utilizing it to make a decision. A case report, for example, is a study of one person or maybe a small group of people in response to something. So, seeing how one person responds to a particular treatment is not the best level of evidence, right? Because people are different. Some people respond differently than others. Great example, early on when people were starting to do the ketogenic diet, some people respond really well to that type of diet. Other people do not. So same thing. Some people respond very strongly to caffeine, and it frees up free fatty acids and spares glucose really well for them. Other people don't. So if you only study one person, you might get a flawed conclusion because everybody's a little bit different. Case control studies are kind of that next step up. They aren't just on one person. They're on maybe a few people, a few that get the treatment, a few that don't, and better than a case report, but still fairly small and so on. And as we move up this pyramid, we start to see studies that have greater and greater quality, and we can put more and more faith in. This whole middle group here are studies, individual studies that are conducted by researchers and so on. The best of that group are randomized controlled trials, where they take a group of people, they randomly assign them to two groups, they control the one group and don't do anything, or they do the normal treatment, and then they do the intervention on another group, and then they look at the results, right? So those are the highest quality of the individual studies. The best supported type of information are systematic reviews of the literature and meta-analyses, which are basically systematic reviews that also run data analysis. And those are seen at the top of the chain because they look at multiple studies that examined the same thing and make conclusions. So while the one study that this person did, maybe they had a flawed methodology. They measured incorrectly. They only used a specific population. There are weaknesses that exist in these randomized control trials that systematic reviews, because they review a whole bunch of randomized controlled trials, can overcome because they look at multiple studies. So anyway, when you're looking for evidence and you find these types of articles, we can put more faith in types of articles at the top of the pyramid than we can at the bottom of the pyramid. Since we haven't really gone over the different types of study designs yet, I want to talk briefly about what they are so that when you start looking at article titles, you can start figuring out, hey, this is probably this type of study, or this is probably that type of study, and so on. So let's talk about different study designs and how they relate to the quality of the information. So an expert opinion, which was down at the bottom of the pyramid, right? There's lots of opinion around. Make sure your expert is an expert and that they're providing information that they have researched, that they have applied, and so on. But expert opinion is a nice source of information, but we always want to kind of validate it when possible. A case study is an observational type of research that typically looks at one person or one group of people or one particular situation over a period of time. So here's a couple example titles I pulled from the literature. It's high intensity interval training improves cardiovascular health, exercise capacity, and quality of life in permanent atrial fibrillation, a case study. They probably took one person and they had them do high intensity interval training, and they looked and see how they benefited from that. But that's on one person. A case study, another one is entitled A Case Study of the Training of 9-time New York Marathon winner Greta Waitz. So here again, really interesting. Can we learn a lot from someone who's been that successful at a sport? Certainly. But can everybody train at the level that she did? Probably not. But it does provide some useful information. Case control studies are where we have an observational study, but then we also have two groups that where we do one thing to one group, we do another thing to another group, and then we look at performance or outcomes. An example is an article entitled Physical Activity Level and Stroke Risk in a U.S. Population, a case-matched control study of 102,578 individuals. So this was a massive health study that gathered tons of information on these people over a length of time. And they went back after they've gathered this data and quantified the people into two groups. One group that did physical activity at a certain level or higher, another group that did not do physical activity at that level. And then they looked at their stroke incidents over that time period. So again, something that is really useful information, but doesn't necessarily pertain exactly to our particular situation and individual. A cohort study is a similar type of study that uses longitudinal data within a cohort and then takes measurements in various cross-sections of that population over time. So here's an example. A resistance exercise alone and in combination with aerobic exercise and obesity in Dallas, Texas, a prospective cohort study. So they looked at this group of individuals and then put them into these groups: resistance exercise by itself, resistance exercise along with aerobic exercise, and how that affected obesity in this population in Dallas, Texas. And then a randomized controlled trial is typically where you take a group of people, you break them randomly. It's typically a homogeneous group of people, so maybe it's college athletes, and then you break them into two groups randomly, assign them a treatment, measure their performance before the treatment, measure their performance after the treatment, and look at the effect. So randomized controlled trials have titles like this: the effect of concurrent resistance training on upper body strength, sprint swimming performance, and kinematics in competitive adolescent swimmers, a randomized controlled trial. So that was a study where they took a bunch of swimmers. These were adolescent swimmers that were competitive. Half of them did resistance training on their upper body along with their normal training, and then they looked at their outcome measures of sprint swimming performance or time and kinematics, as well as upper body strength development. So that's what they measured, and that's how what they looked at. And you can see in these titles, often they include the PICO type things that you might be interested in. They have the population, they have the intervention, they have the comparison, and then they have the outcomes. Another randomized controlled trial title is Progressive Resistance Exercise as Complementary Therapy Improves Quality of Life and Body Composition in Anorexia Nervosa. So this tells us, again, the population is individuals with anorexia. The intervention was adding progressive resistance exercise. And then their outcome measures were quality of life and body composition. So again, these are examples of different types of studies and at those different points in our pyramid. The systematic review and meta-analysis typically have titles like this: the effect of lifestyle coaching, including telemonitoring and telecoaching on gestational weight gain and postnatal weight loss, a systematic review. The nice thing about systematic reviews is they often have the term systematic review in their title. I love reading systematic. If I have a topic I'm researching, I love when I find a systematic review, especially if it's a recent systematic review, because they've done a lot of the heavy lifting for me, right? They have gone out, done a search of the literature for me, and found the articles that were relevant to that topic. So if my topic and their topic are very close, that's a ton of bang for the buck by reading one article, right? A meta-analysis is a systematic review typically, but where they take the data from their studies and plug them into their own data set and then run the data on a much larger population. So they basically are a systematic review with some additional data analysis, which is also a very high level of evidence and great information for you to use when making your decisions.